All right, good evening. My name is Jay Carpenter, and I'm the founder of Desert Blockchain. And I want to thank everybody for participating tonight. This is a bit of an experience. There we go. Okay, try that. So, sorry about this. We're dealing with some audio issues. So this is a bit of an experiment. We're doing this completely virtually, and I am at Desert Blockchain Camp, which is here in Phoenix, Arizona. And I just want to check, is my audio okay for everybody? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you good.
Okay, good. So one of the value propositions of Desert Blockchain Community is that normally on the fourth Wednesday of every month, we get together here in the Desert Blockchain Camp, and we're able to network at least an hour beforehand. And because of the current circumstances, that's not happening. So this is an experiment to try and continue to build our community virtually. We are going to talk about decentralization and crisis, and take a look at how are decentralized constructs different than centralized constructs, and what might be the opportunity set in this current environment, not only the COVID-19 crisis, but we're sure to face other crises in the future. And if we walk away with anything tonight out of this conversation, I hope it's maybe some new possibilities around using decentralized constructs in a time of crisis to our advantage. So that's really the possibility out of tonight's conversation, is to explore, open this up. This is going to be an open conversation. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have any comments, questions, or whatever. I would like to take a little bit of our time and just kind of go around and have everybody do a brief introduction, say anything you would like to get out of tonight, what you would hope to possibly achieve or brainstorm around, and maybe talk a little bit about what you're currently working on. So let's see. Let's start with Chad. Chad, will you kind of introduce yourself?
I was just going to say what we do. And okay, so I've lived here in Phoenix for a little over a year. And I work at CVS Health in infrastructure. I work in financial payments for pharmacy benefit planning. Before that, I did software engineering in Seattle before moving here. Pretty much been at Desert Blockchain from when I got here, and kind of like met a lot of people in the community. So what I'm looking to do out of this session, I just like hanging out with blockchain people, you know, really, really smart and interesting. I can't hang out with regular people that easily. So yeah, that's kind of what I kind of get your guys' thoughts on the emerging world events and kind of like decentralized type solutions that all of a sudden kind of can be useful given some chaotic scenarios in the world.
And will you talk about what you've stood up in the cloud with Filecoin?
Oh yeah, so the projects that I work on in the AWS cloud is, I'm actually updating right now, is Facebook's Libra and Filecoin, the two projects I focus on and try and follow those as close as I can. So yeah, Jay and I have some other projects we work on in the cloud too. So if you guys are interested in kind of walking through any of those, let me know. I'm happy to schedule a Zoom call and go through that stuff too. It's kind of fun to keep up with some of the bigger name projects that are going on right now.
Cool. Thank you. All right, Jason, mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. So I'm, Jason. You know, I try to help organize these things with Jay. However, Jay has definitely taken the lead on pretty much everything for quite some time now. I work on a project called Nori full time, which is a carbon market, effectively, where we have some of our components, the trading bits on the blockchain. So we do lots of things there with things like carbon offsets, like market, but typically deal strictly with carbon removal. So matching people who are interested in removing their carbon footprint with people who are removing CO2 from the atmosphere.
Cool. And Nori was in the Techstars program in Colorado last fall, just before they launched, and they are now live, and they're getting quite a bit of attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Techstars is a fantastic program. If anyone's interested in hearing more about that experience, I'd happy to share it with them. It was one of the best experiences ever, but also just like really fantastic for accelerating a business from one step to the next.
And Nori's also doing some things with Microsoft as well. And
that's right.
Our next session in April, on April 22nd, will feature Jason and Nori.com. So, cool. Thank you. Scott, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I'm Scott. Professionally, my background is largely computer science, programming, and kind of basically sysadmin work. So a little bit of IT, a little bit of programming. As far as the blockchain kind of tech stack goes, I'm primarily concerned in the space when it comes to security and privacy, and so there's a lot of kind of privacy related projects I have my finger in terms of doing minor contributions, but as far as blockchain goes, it's largely just localization and helping organize the DEF CON village for the blockchain, cryptocurrency known as Monero. So.
And Scott gave a great presentation, which we're going to highlight here very soon, on Monero, and we'll kind of do a refresh on that. So, thank you, Scott. Eileen, can you give us an introduction?
Oh, hi. I am not one of the newly working from home. I'm one of the long time working from home, and so very amused with everybody who's having to deal with their spouses, family, children, pets while they're at home. We're old hands at that, at all of us freelancers. Anyways, don't have anything in the works right now, but always exciting possibilities on the horizon.
So Eileen helps us with our social media here at Desert Blockchain, and she's also very active in the STEM and education community. So I appreciate the work you do, Eileen. Tairia.
Yeah. Hi everybody, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so first of all, I'm probably the newest member. I think I've been a member for the last 30 minutes. So I think that's gonna be hard to beat. So I'm originally from Norway and spent quite a bit of time here in the US, but also in Denmark for 2.5 years, and then in France for 2.5 years. And mostly been, working as a ASIC designer, RF digital designer for quite a few years, and now because I realized hardware is hard, switched over to a lot of software. I did that and started a couple of companies and sold the last one like 3 years ago, and now been very focused on genomics. And started a company here with a local company here in the Valley called TGen, stands for Transgenomics. So we have a for-profit company that we started called Life Lab. And we are focused now on remote clinical trials. And my interest is really around, the healthcare part of it. We collect a lot of data, not just genetics data, but liquid biomarkers. We do wearable devices to track activity, sleep, and so on. So there's a bunch of different data coming in. And I think that is part of my interest here in blockchain, and also the identity part of it as well. I think we're still very early on, but clearly interested in that, and also interested in partly because of the previous companies I was involved in, where we did insurance products. So I think talking about the insurance accelerators, I was involved in the global insurance accelerator out of Des Moines, and I highly recommend that for anybody who's involved in insurance. But so I think in a small way I'm interested in it from an insurance point of view, but mostly from a healthcare point of view. When it comes to my expertise in blockchain and identity, it's close to zero.
Okay, thank you. I need to do another sound check. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think I've got the echo
Yeah, you're good.
under control now. Cool. All right. Shams, will you do just a brief introduction again? Because yours was not recorded.
Okay, sure. My name is Shams Hadi, CEO and co-founder of ZoroSign. We're into the user privacy, data and document security, and user authentication validation space on the blockchain. Our technology runs a digital signature platform for users who want to build out on that. We, like I mentioned, we're built ground up on the blockchain, so it is using Hyperledger Fabric. I'm new to the community, and hopefully we'll be moving to Phoenix in the next couple of months based on how things happen globally, but currently in Dubai, and looking forward to learning from all of you and sharing my experiences as well over the next near future.
Cool. Thank you. Randy, you mind introducing yourself?
Thanks. So Randy Graham, I've moved to the Valley, Phoenix in 1993. I have an accounting and an IT background, as well in the healthcare industry, Tersh. So familiar with a lot of healthcare terminology and the industry itself. And actually, I am from Des Moines, Iowa. I heard you mention the name Des Moines. There are several insurance companies. The Principal Financial Group, actually, both of my parents worked there for over 30 years. So, so currently have my own contracting business, consulting firm, working with some legacy clients. But that only keeps me busy for, part-time, maybe 10, 15 hours a week. So over the last 2 years, I've been intently trying to learn everything I can about blockchain, and currently trying to understand as much as I can about the Chainlink protocol and how that's working to provide the data information, the oracles on the Ethereum network, and probably I anticipate them probably expanding into the Tezos network as well sometime in the near future. But again, intently learning as much as I can, and been attending these meetups for probably about 2 years now, a little over 2 years.
Cool. All right. I think that covers everybody. Is there anybody I missed? Anybody want to say anything in particular before we get started on the presentation? Okay.
Well, I'd like to introduce myself.
Oh, how could I forget?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Carpenter.
Nice.
And I'm Jay's wife. And I have been interested to hear what's going to get presented tonight, and to hear what the community has to say about everything that's going on around the world, and how decentralization can actually be a powerful platform for resolving some of the issues we're facing. So I'm here to hear the geniuses at work. So it's great to be here with everyone.
Cool.
Hey, Jay, Jade, if you don't mind, I want to say one other thing to Shams. Several of us recently went to the Hyperledger International Conference, which was actually here in Phoenix. So we got a little bit of an exposure to some of the projects that are happening on the Hyperledger network, and so that was really interesting. And this is obviously a very apropos meeting, and I want to kind of reiterate my primary interest out of this meeting is just to get an idea of what everybody else thinks about some of the possible protocols that could have been in place already, or that we should probably think about putting in place as a nation to potentially deal with future epidemics, pandemics, etc. Because our healthcare system is so vital to, obviously, to our survival. So this is a very apropos meeting. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Randy. I think you bring up a great point, because so I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation, and what you just articulated, Randy, I think is absolutely on point. Can everybody see the presentation? You got a yes? Okay, cool. So tonight's topic is decentralization and crisis, and this conversation is an opportunity to take a look at this thing we're calling decentralization, which, let's assume it's a new construct that's only maybe 12 years old, if that, with the advent of Bitcoin. So I'm looking at decentralization as a new way of collectively organizing and having an ecosystem that is as close to peer-to-peer as possible. And the let me do something real quick here. Sorry about this. I do want to. There we go. Okay, good. So we're looking at the alternative of how do we construct peer-to-peer decentralized constructs for organization, for economic purposes, for healthcare, for information, for identity, all these different things. So I really am asking everybody to look at this, the constructs that we're talking about, as a new opportunity for societal organization, and what are the possibilities. And yes, we're in this COVID-19 crisis, but as Randy just articulated, and others I'm sure are thinking, there are sure to be other crises in the future. And whatever the crisis is, what can we create, basically, is the question. So in the presentation, I've focused on basically 4 elements to compare decentralization with centralization. 1 is trust, 2, choice, 3, control, and 4, responsibility. And I'll just briefly talk about these items. So trust, we experience trust in both centralized as well as decentralized constructs. The difference with trust in a centralized construct versus a decentralized construct is we trust some sort of centralized entity, be it a government, enterprise, or whatever, to basically look out for our own interests. And we kind of turn that over. And I'll jump down to the bottom of the list, kind of the same thing in terms of responsibility. We kind of, with centralized constructs, we turn the responsibility for our safety over to our police, our military, and so forth. And we trust those entities to basically look out for that particular area of our life, that we turn the responsibility over to them, and we trust them. I do not want to be in a position where I'm trying to defend my family from harm. I want the police to do that. I want the military to do that. And to a large degree, I trust that. But in decentralized constructs, we actually are in a peer-to-peer realm where we don't really trust any other peer. And yet this instance of trust emerges out of a adversarial relationship with all other peers. And but from that, we get an experience of trust from adversarial relationships with everybody else that's in the ecosystem. That's really a paradox to me. And the responsibility to look out for our interests shifts to us as a peer. So it's my responsibility to protect my assets or information that is held in this decentralized construct called blockchain or peer-to-peer networks and so forth. Let's talk about choice a little bit. In centralized constructs, we may not have as many choices as we do with decentralized constructs. From the very nature of it, it's centralized. There's one government that we either choose to be United States citizens, or we renounce our citizenship and we go elsewhere. Now that might be changing with something called global citizenship, but if we were in truly a decentralized global citizenship realm, we might be able to actually pick and choose what country we fly our individual flags under at what given point in time. For instance, the Estonian e-residency construct. So in terms of control, the control is also, we've got a different control set with a peer-to-peer construct and a decentralized construct. We actually, and this kind of goes hand in hand with choice and trust for that matter, and responsibility, but with decentralized constructs, we can choose where we want to control our assets. Do we want to control it in the Bitcoin ecosystem? Do we want to control it in the Ethereum ecosystem? Do we want to have control in the IPFS Protocol Labs ecosystem? You name it, Monero. So we can actually sort of fine-tune our control of different elements and dimensions of our life in decentralized constructs. We have a greater choice, I would say, of control mechanisms. So those are some of the fundamental things that I chose to just sort of highlight as we're going through this comparison of centralized constructs and decentralized constructs. And by the way, I would like to emphasize that in my view, there's nothing inherently superior or, one doesn't, centralized constructs and decentralized constructs, they're not 100% completely desirable or undesirable in either case. I think we actually need a mix of both. So, but back to our topic of decentralization and crisis, I would like to bring everybody's attention to this March 2015 TED Talk by Bill Gates, which was titled "The Next Outbreak, We're Not Ready." And in this TED Talk, he does, I think, an amazing job of basically highlighting exactly the COVID-19 crisis that we're currently in. And you have to watch it for yourself, but I think he pretty much hits every highlight that we're currently experiencing. And from this TED Talk, I learned of this pandemic that occurred in 1918 called the Spanish flu. And this particular video sort of highlights I believe it's about 100 million people died during that pandemic in 1918. And I think there were only about 1 billion, billion and a half people on the face of the planet at that time. The other remarkable thing about the Spanish flu pandemic is I would assert that mobility was not as great on a global scale during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So in my mind, that makes a potent virus like COVID-19 even more of a concern today than it was, at that time. So those are a couple dimensions that I think we should keep in mind. And at the start of this, let's say 2 weeks ago, I was of the opinion that this COVID-19 pandemic was not that big a deal. I did not know that we'd already experienced a similar phenomenon back in 1918, which was basically a global crisis. So here's a great podcast that just came out on March 19th with Tyler Cowen and Russ Roberts of Econ Talk and the Stanford Hoover Institute, and Tyler Cowen's with George Mason University. But I'd highly recommend this podcast because Tyler Cowen's, I think, an incredible economist, legal expert, and so forth, and has great insight not only into this phenomenon, but other phenomenons in economics and society. This is a talk that was done a few years ago, I guess 4 years ago, by Thomas E. Ricks, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and historian and expert. But he basically talks about how we're always building our defenses for the last crisis. So he says, and this is not unique to the United States or any other society, but societies tend to build their defenses to protect from the last crisis or the last war. And in this talk, he talks about how we put all kinds of money into aircraft carriers, bombers, all these sort of almost centralized elements, and we built our military to be rather static versus agile. And he talks about how we are vulnerable from cyber attacks as well as terrorist attacks and so forth. And he doesn't, as I recall, talk about bioweapons in this talk, but the same principles still hold true in Thomas E. Ricks' talk about why I fear we will lose our next big war. So let me just run through a couple more and then we'll just kind of open it up for conversation. And this is a TED Talk by Juan Benet, who's the founder of Protocol Labs. And in this, he talks about how the internet has become centralized and many of our networks are vulnerable to attacks, censorship, failure, and so forth. So again, this is I think a well done survey of where we're at today in terms of our network and our information systems and where decentralization could take us. This is an actual demonstration that just occurred last Monday. And this actually uses IPFS, the Interplanetary File System. This is an amazing demonstration of how we can create virtual worlds, virtual conferences using IPFS and using not only virtual reality, but also augmented reality within virtual reality. And in this talk, this particular presenter goes by the name of Jin, talks about a conference, just like a trade show or whatever that you would go to, where they had like 600 exhibitors. And the next conference they're going to have is going to be about 1,100. Anyway, I think Chad had an opportunity to take a look at this and was also amazed at this particular demonstration. But this particular this demonstration, I think, highlights where we might be operating, especially in this new realm of where there's almost become like this wall between all of us. As Cindy and I were walking through Target just this week, you know, it was a strange feeling to encounter somebody in the aisles, the shopping aisles, because there was this uncertainty and this distrust that I've never experienced before. And if somebody was coughing, it was almost like they were pointing a gun at me, was the feeling that I had. And it was just very, very eerie. So this particular demonstration shows how we might be able to simulate our experience of in-person conferences, meetings, and environments. I'm not going to talk about this. These are great articles. I'm not going to talk about this. In this particular slide, I started to touch upon the points of centralized constructs, their incentives, i.e. governments and the military and so forth, versus decentralized constructs. And this is not totally true, but it's just a way to look at various elements at play in a crisis or even outside of a crisis. But centralized constructs, let's say like governments, I assert generally tend to try to eliminate risks, whereas decentralized constructs tend to manage risks. And, you know, one of the best examples I could make of this particular framework for looking at different, devices and elements is if somebody's in an administrative position, let's say, you know, you're responsible for the cybersecurity, okay, which is kind of like an administrative position. If you're doing your job, people leave you alone. The problem happens if somehow there's a breach. So if something goes wrong, you get negative feedback. You get fired, you get put on probation or whatever. If everything's going all right, you're just basically holding your own and nobody's bothering you. So that's kind of a tendency to try to eliminate risks. I used to be a securities broker, okay? And it was just the opposite as a securities broker, which is sort of like running your own business within a business. But I would get rewarded, I would get praised when things went right. Basically, when I got a big client, did a big transaction, so forth, I would get all this, applause. If I messed it up somehow, there was really not much of a consequence. So, I didn't get the applause, basically. So I bring up these incentive sets to highlight what can happen in a crisis. And maybe one of the best examples of that was Hurricane Katrina, whereas, we had these, and I don't want to demean anybody, but, we had these sort of centralized constructs, FEMA and, you name it, whatever, these established constructs that came in and were trying to help. But there were all sorts of bottlenecks because there were all these, attempts to eliminate risks. Whereas just sort of grassroots rescue attempts people getting in boats, floating around, delivering goods to people sitting on rooftops, all that sort of thing. And I'm not an expert on this, but I think if you take a look at the, the documentation and the documentaries on this, but basically those grassroots, decentralized, just get in the boat and go give somebody some whatever they need, those were more effective and much more much quicker to deliver relief to the people that were in crisis in Hurricane Katrina. And I think there are other examples that we could point to. So I'm not going to go into this. I'll just quickly flash through it, agreement and trust. But this kind of highlights centralized constructs versus decentralized, more of the same. I would like to talk about this a little bit in terms of centralized networks and decentralized networks, because a lot of people don't quite get this blockchain thing. Why is this so powerful? Why are people so enamored with it? Well, oftentimes in centralized networks, it's a lot like the postal system before they had any kind of tracking. We would drop a letter in the mail and we'd kind of be in a state of, I'm not certain if the letter is going to get there or not, until whoever got it on the other end received the letter and hopefully, called or responded and said, okay, I got the letter. And you didn't really know what was happening in between. In a decentralized network, both sides have the ability to audit what's going on at any time. It's analogous to FedEx tracking, where the sender and the receiver, let's assume they are adversaries, they can track exactly what's going on at any given point in time, and they have a degree of trust in FedEx. It's certainly a centralized entity, but it's just an analogy of one of the benefits that we are attracted to in decentralized networks is the ability to track and sort of audit as things take place, and both sides can constantly be checking on the status of the network. So the other thing about centralized networks is, in the past, they've been very siloed. And decentralized networks, all of a sudden, these siloed entities are starting to meld or merge into one another. And that creates a very powerful set of alternatives to the centralized constructs. Then I'll just talk briefly about money. And I think there's probably, everybody's kind of scratching their heads about what's going to happen with the economy, what's going to happen with the availability of cash, what's going to happen when all of a sudden $2 trillion is, dumped into the economy, and how fast is that going to happen? So with these decentralized constructs, we actually have our own capability to create our own forms of money, currency, exchange, value, and so forth. So that's about it. There are other materials in the back, which I won't go into, but just general materials on decentralized constructs and blockchain and so forth. So I'll stop the screen share at that. So is everybody still awake? And any comments? What do you folks hear out of that look at decentralization in a time of crisis versus centralization? And Robert has joined us as well. Welcome, Robert. And more importantly, what are some opportunities that we might be able to construct using decentralization? Some of us on this session are in the healthcare realm, and not only in healthcare, but also genomics, information technologies, and so forth. Does anybody see any particular opportunities?
I think some of the opportunities come from kind of the highlighting of the shortcomings of some of the current systems and structures we have in place now. Even though people can talk about it, once you actually see kind of like how inefficient some of the systems we use now are, then and more people see it, then kind of the urgency to build something new will kind of arise and give some more urgency to some projects that can kind of create new and better systems. So I think, in the next, months, however long this lasts, we're going to get a very clear picture of just what's broken and how bad. Like supply chain is a big one, because we'll kind of test our supply chain. There's a lot of tracking technologies that can give us a lot better insight into how our supply chain is performing, and not just for toilet paper, for other stuff too.
Yeah, I was gonna say 2 words: supply chain. I think that's the theme here. Not only to identify. I mean, clearly, we're now concerned about the fact that China produces the majority of our pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
But also, what's the current crisis on, rubber meets the road? It's healthcare workers don't have the appropriate. So why couldn't there be a blockchain process that could identify inventory at any location in the country, and then be marked for delivery the next day, or even potentially the same day? Because we clearly have that capability. We see it. FedEx, like you were showing, FedEx, UPS, and the USPS all deliver next day. You just got to pay for it, and you can track it. You know exactly where it is along the way. So the supply chain really is the key, I think. And the bill that Congress has passed or that's been introduced to potentially incentivize, and the fact that the president invoked the War Powers Act to incentivize manufacturing firms in this country to literally make sure we always have medical supplies in the future, and to bring the pharmaceutical manufacturing back to this country. So it's clear there's some opportunity, low-hanging fruit opportunities in this crisis.
I agree, Chad, Randy, your points that you brought up, and Jay, thanks for bringing up a couple of points that really stood out to me. And one was the hybrid of centralized and decentralized. I think there's a fine match that has to be addressed in both aspects for it to work in some sort of marriage. And I believe that there are 2 underlying principles that we would have to come up and address before supply chain and and the other aspects that you guys mentioned is basically trust and security. I think it would be easy to throw everything up onto the blockchain and deliver it or have it, but then there's so much behind it. And with data being the next currency of the world, which I think everyone agrees with, if it is not laid out correctly, and then obviously there's another issue is there's so many different systems out there today that integrating or bring them on board will take time, but you basically need everyone's buy-in for that. And for that, in my opinion, it's the security and the trust aspect that really needs to be addressed. Like, I think we've all seen how blockchain basically was Bitcoin for the longest time, and people just didn't really get it. that it was, they're two different topics completely. And so that's my 2 cents in adding into the feedback and what you have shared as well.
Cool. Thank you.
I think going back to kind of the topic of supply chain too is, I think it's worth highlighting. There are different kind of manufacturing methods. So the method that tends to be employed, I think, by a good number of companies in manufacturing is what's known as, referred to as just-in-time manufacturing, where basically you make products kind of on a need to sell basis. You don't have an inventory or that kind of thing. And so for cases like the particular kind of health crisis that we have going on across the world, that kind of manufacturing method, supply chain method that's one of the weak points is for surges in need like this. So I mean, maybe there are technologies that could potentially mitigate those limitations, but I think it's also worth highlighting. It isn't necessarily technologies so much as how goods are in the supply chain itself. How goods are made in the supply chain. To address something like this health crisis, you really do have to have, at least for the hospitals and health staff, potentially a higher, a decent number of protective gear. But I mean, the con is that that you have to swallow the cost of the storage for all of that and so forth, and logistics of that storage. But maybe I don't know. There's some sort of technology that would assist in making that easy in terms of identifying assets and where exactly they are and how quickly you can move them about. But
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Scott. And how many times have we heard of a crisis happening in some country, and again, not to be derogatory, but let's say less developed country, and there are these dock loads of supplies, desperately needed supplies, that are sitting there, that may be perishable and wasting. And because there isn't a supply chain and a way to get the goods from point A to point B, or a way to do it in an efficient manner, all these tragedies occur where the things are so close to satisfy the desperate needs of the people, but the supply chain has broken down, or the logistics chain has broken down, and it's as if all this effort to get these resources to people at the time they need it just goes to waste. So I think that's a great point. Other points? We got about 5 minutes. I would like to say that this is probably one of the most concerning crisis events that I've ever experienced. And, I've been on this planet longer than most of you. And without these decentralized alternatives, I think I would be in a much more worrisome state. I would feel much more like things are totally out of my control. I would feel like I had, less choice. I would be very concerned about how much I trust various entities and constructs. But because we have these decentralized alternatives that are, I'll say, for the most part, open source, that the folks on this call, the folks in this community, have the technical wherewithal to stand up some of these constructs and actually get them up and operating if necessary, I'm in a much more peaceful state of mind, because I know that we have these abilities. So that's one point. Second point I'd like to make to kind of close this out, and I'm sorry if I'm taking up time, other people might want to say something, but when this all started to shift for me, and it shifted from a crisis of, well, this is just being, touted as something that's, it's really not what they're saying it is. When all of a sudden I started shifting from, well, this will blow over and it's not a big deal, to, hey, this could be a really, really big deal. My first reaction was fight or flight, okay, which is very basic, very survivalistic. And, I started thinking about, okay, where could we move to, get out of town, go to some remote place, some location, store goods, blah, blah, blah. And versus, what are the possibilities of staying right here, right in the middle of, the 5th largest metropolitan area in the United States? What's better? Is it better to go isolated, or is it better to stay within the community and start to build synergies among all of us who have different skill sets and different strengths? And particularly today, where we are so connected, with our iPhones and our computers, and now on Zoom and everything else, it became clear to me that the former instinct to go hide away in a cave was had a higher probability of disaster, because I cannot do everything by myself. None of us can. However, with these constructs where we can now interact on a peer-to-peer basis with checks and balances on, our assurances of operating in a possibly an adversarial but trusted fashion, it's clear to me that the constructs that we're all interested in offer a new alternative and a new path, not only for survival, but to ultimately thrive. So that's kind of my conclusion of where we're at. And we're at the end of our time. I want to thank each and every one of you for participating in this conversation. And, at a minimum, we'll have this format in April. I'm thinking about having some other open sessions like this, maybe not with a presentation, but basically open it up to the entire community, not just citizens, with, less structure, see how that goes. But I just want to thank everybody for being part of this, and I welcome your feedback on how this can be improved, and what other formats, actions, endeavors we can take to not only explore decentralization in crisis, but any and all opportunities. So thank you very much. Any last comments before we close?
Hey, thank you, Jay.
Yeah, thank you for this on, Jay.
Cool. All right, everybody, have a good night, and thank you for participating. I'll get this out and distribute it within a day.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.